If you've been following the news, you've probably seen reports that Thailand is facing a fuel crisis with lengthy queues at gas stations and apparent shortages. I'm Cal and I'm here in Bangkok, and you'll see right behind me, here's a gas station, no long queues, just a few cars coming and going. It looks like business as usual. So what's really happening? Let's start with the immediate cause. The war in the Middle East has largely shut down the Strait of Hormuz. This is one of the most important oil transit routes in the world, with approximately 1/5 of global crude and LNG passing through the strait. And Thailand's particularly exposed as the country's heavily dependent on energy shipments from the Gulf, along with much of the rest of Asia. So pressure on supplies is building across the entire region. And throughout much of Asia, governments are activating conservation and support measures. But to be totally honest, here on the streets of Bangkok, you wouldn't notice that there was a fuel crisis unless you were paying attention to the news. The traffic is as busy as ever, and the government has stated that the country has between 95 and 100 days of fuel reserves. And officials have repeatedly stated that they're sourcing new fuel supplies in case of a prolonged disruption. But as the old adage goes, bad news travels quickly, especially in the age of social media. And the perception that there's a shortage is the problem, especially in smaller and more rural provinces. And that's because fuel stations are generally efficient and designed to supply a specific area based on average consumption rates, not sudden spikes in demand. When panic buying and hoarding begin, that capacity gets overwhelmed. And that's what's leading to scenes of long queues, empty pumps, and in some cases, actual shortages. Stations in smaller outlying areas simply can't restock fast enough to meet the abnormal demand. That creates more images of shortages, which then feeds back into more panic buying. And one of the biggest underlying drivers has been a key government support policy. As prices began to rise, the Thai government introduced significant fuel subsidies, capping diesel at around 30 baht per litre, with the state covering up to 40% of the cost in some cases. But that support has come at a price. The oil fuel fund has slipped into a deficit of nearly 10 billion baht, and officials have already signaled plans to gradually lift the cap to reduce the fiscal burden. And while the policy has helped ease cost pressures for households, it also triggered a secondary effect, with drivers and especially farmers operating on thin margins, rushing to stockpile fuel at lower prices, particularly in rural areas where logistical bottlenecks are tighter, filling up vehicles and in some cases dozens of jerry cans in anticipation of future price increases, which has led to rationing at some stations. But there is no structural shortage, and you can see behind me, construction is operating as normal. The horns are honking, the traffic is dense. Bangkok and the major tourist hotspots are functioning normally. Now, this doesn't mean the oil shortage isn't causing issues. It definitely is. The International Energy Agency has called this the biggest energy shock in history. And like the rest of the world, Thailand is dealing with higher energy prices. And as those higher energy costs trickle through almost everything from food to transportation, accommodation, even wages, expect prices to go up. But none of this is unique to Thailand, as countries around the world are facing very similar price pressures with the rising energy costs. And the Thai government is pursuing a two-track policy. The first is stabilization. Authorities are capping diesel prices and releasing additional supply into the market, while emphasizing that the country has sufficient reserves and additional sourcing options to prevent further panic buying. But the second track is contingency planning. Thailand still has access to emergency powers dating back to the 1973 oil crisis, when global supply disruptions forced governments to move beyond market mechanisms and into direct control of energy distribution. While broader energy conservation measures could be introduced across commercial and public spaces, including limits on air conditioning, lighting, and operating hours. These type of measures were actually introduced during the 1973 oil crisis. But of course, Thailand was a very different place at that time. And as things stand, this remains a contingency plan if the conflict lasts for months and the government can't secure sufficient additional supplies. And right now, there is no structural fuel shortage. And if you're planning a visit to Thailand, you probably wouldn't notice that there's a crisis unless you turn on the news.